Hello class, April Cano here, presenting to you on a memoir by Pat Conroy titled The Water is Wide. I would first like to show you some images that hopefully most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with and can identify with. The first one here is of the famous baseball player Babe Ruth. This is something we are all informed of. It's the country that we live in. Some of you may immediately correlate this picture with a holiday celebrated by some, known as Halloween. We can all answer the question to that equation, and on most days, we can fill in the blank on this tag. However, the children that we meet in The Water is Wide were unable to answer these questions when Pat Conroy arrived at the island to be their teacher. There are a few reasons why I wanted to read this book for the presentation. At first, it sounded as though there was an educator trying to aid some island that is undergoing a natural disaster, and that was inspiring. It sounds like something I would do, or that I try to do on a normal daily basis, is save people and save things and come up with solutions and problem solve. I also wanted to find ways to compare an elementary school environment to the higher education environment that we are all in. This book is also based on a true story, so I found that to be intriguing and wanted to learn more about things that have occurred in our education system. I've also learned a great deal about this author since having picked up just this one book of his. Pat Conroy actually has 10 or so other novels, fiction, nonfiction, memoirs, stories that he has written that are based on, heavily based on anyways, personal experiences and things that he has witnessed in his lifetime. So let's talk a little bit more about Pat Conroy. Pat Conroy was born in Atlanta, but grew up as a military brat. He had a father who was in the Marine Corps, so he and his family bounced around from town to town and school to school. This was something that bothered Pat Conroy. He really wanted to have one home, be settled, have a group of friends, and attend one school. And that didn't happen for him until he was in high school. Keep in mind, Pat Conroy grew up during the 50s and the 60s, meaning that he was a witness or encountered things like racism and the assassinations of JFK and of Martin Luther King Jr. When he became a teacher, he also witnessed racist acts in his classroom and on his campuses. Pat Conroy did attend a military college, but that was more so to please his parents because Pat Conroy is not a fighter. He's a do-gooder. He's a lover. He saw bad in this world and decided at that point that he wanted to change that and to do good. And so he's not militaristic. He's not a harmful or hateful person, and he doesn't support racism. He doesn't support the war. He was criticized a lot for this growing up by his family, especially by his father, and even by his friends, because he was the do-gooder in the group. I feel like he's an expert because the stories that he writes and the things that he shares are real to him. They really occurred and are real issues that we need to address in our education system and in our political system and so on. Let's now overview what the book The Water is Wide is about. It is about an island called Yamacraw Island in South Carolina that's roughly based on an island close to where Conroy is from called Daufuskie Island. Daufuskie Island, or Yamacraw Island, used to be famous for its oysters. Then a factory was built not far from the island on the mainland that just destroyed and contaminated the waters around the island. And at that point, the oyster business was done. The downfall of the people, of the economy, and of the education system began. Conroy heard about this, and he wanted an opportunity to get to the island, an island not far from where he's from, and help in any way that he could. He heard there was a teaching job, and that is what he already was, a teacher, so he knew that that was a place for him. He got the job by going into the superintendent, Dr. Piedmont's office, and begging for it. Dr. Piedmont thought he was a godsend. He thought he was crazy because he wanted to go to this island that was poor and neglected and uneducated, but Conroy saw it as an opportunity to make a change. He got the job. He became a commuter because he had a boat to and from the island, which presented some problems later on in the book. And his teaching style from day one was noted as unconventional. We'll learn a little bit more about that when we meet the other characters in the book. It is important to know who Mrs. Brown, Mr. Bennington, and Dr. Piedmont are. In this story, Mrs. Brown is the other teacher at the two-teacher school and the principal, because she's the only person that could be the principal. Dr. Piedmont is the superintendent who gave Conroy the job, and Mr. Bennington is the deputy superintendent. He is the only school board official that has ever stepped foot on the island. Mrs. Brown is a black woman, and Bennington and Piedmont are both white men. There are some serious differences, as I previously mentioned, between Mrs. Brown's methods of discipline and teaching and Mr. Conroy's. I wanted to read some excerpts from the book so you have an idea of what these people are like. When referring to Bennington and Piedmont, this is the type of people that they are. Represented a dying part of the South, the venerable hoary-maned administrator who tended his district with the same care and paternalism the master once rendered to his plantation. They were kind of stuck in some old ways, and Conroy noticed that and wanted to bring some awareness to the island and to the people that lived there, that they did not have to be treated like that or undergo the experiences they were any longer. Mrs. Brown was very interesting. She took a more corporal punishment approach. She instilled fear in the children. When talking to Conroy on his first day of school, she told him this, and I quote, "You have to keep your foot on them all the time. Step on them every day and keep stepping on them when they gets out of line." When talking to the children, she told them specifically, "The rest of you can't think as good. We know that, and you know that. Your brains are just slow. But you can learn if you work. You are just lazy. Lazy, and lazy people just can't get ahead in life." So on day one, Conroy witnessed this type of teacher. He saw what he was dealing with in her, and he also learned that the students in his class, which were going to be 18 students between the grades of 5th and 8th, could not count, could not say their ABCs. They did not know what country they lived in. They could not identify famous athletes and famous movie stars. Conroy had his work cut out for him. He also learned that the lifestyle of the parents was poor, that they stayed drunk, and that they stayed out all hours of the night instead of being at home and disciplining their children and raising them a more proper way. So that's what Conroy walked in on and wanted to immediately change the way that these children were being raised. It seems as if the culture of the island was pretty poor and that the school board was aware of that, but neither of the two really worked together to make any changes. For the school board, it was more of an out of sight, out of mind, and for the culture of the island, that's just the way it was. That was the mentality that they had. So the two never really worked together to improve the condition of the island. Some themes of diversity that I found to be present in this book are obviously of race, of religion, or lack thereof, and of education, or lack thereof. We'll learn more about these throughout reaching the conclusion of the book. The first issue at hand is that the people of Yamacraw were apprehensive about Pat Conroy's arrival and that he was a newcomer and he was a white man. This was interesting because he's not the only white person in charge in Yamacraw Island, yet maybe because he was new and white, they were very nervous and unwelcoming of him. This is important to address in higher education because it relates directly to diversity issues. We've learned in this course that we're going to meet all sorts of people with different backgrounds, races, ethnicities, religions, upbringings, and we need to make sure that we're educated and informed on how we can help these students and make sure that they're successful. It's also necessary that we learn to welcome a new person to the office, to the department, on a project, whatever it might be. We're going to have to work with people who are different than us for the rest of our lives. So it's important that we take from this book the methods that Conroy used to kind of make his way and his path through this process a little easier. The second issues are that the leaders of the school board were also apprehensive about Conroy's motives. When Conroy stepped foot in Piedmont's office and asked for this job, they had two completely different perspectives on what was about to happen. Piedmont more so just saw him as a place filler, someone to take over and do what the state asked of teachers, whereas Conroy saw this as an opportunity to bring about positive change to people and to children who desperately needed it. So the issues the issue here is that the expectations and the goals were not outlined up front. Professionals also need to be empowered and entrusted with the ability to bring good and to bring change and to bring success to a school or to an institution. Conroy did not have that from his leaders. There's a lack of respect and a lack of maturity amongst the school board and a lot of politics involved that later on hurt Conroy's position. The third and most critical issue in this book is that the people and the children of Yamacraw Island are uneducated, poor, and neglected. Neglected in the sense that the people outside of the island, including the school board, did not seem to be concerned with the well-being of these people. This is an issue that's important to address in higher education because it is our duty as educators and as administrators to provide adequate support which empowers students. It's noted in this book that if the students are even lucky enough to make it off of Yamacraw Island, they won't be successful if they cannot read and write, and that's pretty understandable for us. We have to consider that students could enter college from similar backgrounds. While they may know their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, they could potentially come from an area where they lack education, where they lack support and empowerment from their parents or from their administrators. Conroy's solutions to these problems were phenomenal. He was known to be a realist, idealist, radical, and blunt. He screamed at the kids, laughed with them, cursed at them and with them, brought content that he was teaching to life for the kids. He didn't necessarily see color or gender roles. He just wanted the students to be encouraged and empowered. He also gauged what the students were already good at and interested in and built from that. So he knew that they liked music, so he taught them how to memorize music and composers. He knew they liked being outside, so he took them in nature and taught them things. He would see beyond their faults and their failures, different from the leaders that the students are used to. In a quote found on page 54, Conroy tells the students, "I then told them that they had to look upon themselves in a different light, that they had to be convinced of their basic worth, and that they could learn just as fast as anybody else." Ultimately, he wanted to gain trust and buy-in from the students and from their parents, and he made every effort to do so. His method started working. The students could tell him what country they lived in. They could identify who Beethoven was. They could count and spell and say their name. It was truly phenomenal that his solutions really did start having an impact on the students. It's really unfortunate what happened to Conroy's role after all of this success came about. He was fired based on the claims from the superintendent and from Bennington that he was insubordinate and irresponsible. He protested this. He took them to the school board and tried to fight this. He had support of parents, but they just weren't having it. In an excerpt from his speech to the school board, he says, "Children who grow up on that island don't have a prayer of receiving an adequate education. They grow up without hope. They leave the island without hope. Their parents are not influential, literate, or vocal, so the educational system is perpetuated. If these parents were white and important, their school would be as fine as any school in the country. But the school is black. The people on the island are black, and my God, the hopelessness of teaching in a black school cut off from society by water is an agony few people have experienced." He then tells the school board, "Forget about your building plans, ordering new volleyballs for the high school, and how many tractors to purchase next year. Think instead about children, people, human beings. Feel for once that education is about people, not figures." If I could interview Mr. Conroy, I would first ask what things and thoughts motivated him to tackle this large task on a daily basis. Obviously, we can all say that children and students are our focus, but sometimes it takes a little bit more than that to keep going. During this time, Pat Conroy was also engaged to be married, so I'm interested in knowing in what ways his relationships with his family and friends was affected by this task. Finally, I would like to hear some advice on how we as educators can convince students that they are capable of more than their potentially poor upbringing like those of Yamacraw Island. I laughed, I cried, and I wanted to read more by Pat Conroy. I was able to relate to some of the themes in the book and ultimately found Conroy to be admirable for his courage, his passion, and his transparency. It's critical that we as educators and administrators are aware of the existing Yamacraws out there and that we find ways to connect students' educational experience from elementary school up through higher education. Thanks for watching.